I did discover something this week, and I was actually praising Robbie and thanking him this week because I realized something. Preaching is not easy. I mean, especially if you're somebody that doesn't like getting up in front of a group of people. Like, it is the one way that I figured out how to stay warm in this auditorium. You get me up here, the heart rate goes up, and then suddenly, I don't have an issue with staying warm. But I was thinking, Robbie, I think it was Thursday or Friday, I called him up, and I was just, making sure we were clear on everything that was going on this weekend. And at one point, I was just telling him how crazy it was and how I could not do this every week. This is a hard job. And then he's like, well, if you're busy this week, do you need me to fill in? And I'm thinking to myself, if Robbie asked me a couple of days before Sunday, hey, something's happened to me, could you fill in? I would be terrified. It would not go well. So I do appreciate Robbie and everything that he does, and because it does take a lot, and God really does use him and bless him. And I appreciate his assistance as we've walked through this series on Entrusted. Well, today is our final week, finally. It's been a long series, I think a very good series, where we've walked through what God has entrusted to us in stewarding the resources that God has given us. Now, before we continue, I just want to recap the principles that we've gone through the last couple of months. And the first principle is this: God owns everything. If there's nothing else that you've taken away from this series, which hopefully you have taken away more than one thing, but if nothing else, we need to remember that God owns everything because it shapes how we handle things. But that leads to stewardship principle number 2, which is the principle of responsibility. I am responsible for what is entrusted to me. I'm not responsible for what God gives to somebody else or their family or their resources or their skills and abilities, but I am responsible to God for what he has given to me, which then leads to stewardship principle number 3, the principle of accountability. I am accountable for what is entrusted to me. There will be a point in time when this life is over that I am standing before God and giving account for how I managed what he has given to me. But I love, because this leads to stewardship principle number 4, Robbie talked about this, which is the principle of reward. God rewards faithfulness. He entrusts us, he gives us resources, it is our responsibility and we're held accountable, but he promises to reward those who are faithful. And then a few weeks ago, I talked about principle number 5, which is the principle of contentment. If God owns everything, I should be content in all circumstances. And over the last 2 weeks, we talked about the principle of giving. Robbie brought it up the first week, and specifically he discussed the importance of giving God our first fruits. And in that, he said, giving is a response of gratitude to God's grace. And last week, as I dug into it further, I just added one sentence onto what Robbie said, and giving helps transform us to be more like Jesus. It's not simply enough to tithe and mark off a to-do list. Giving should come out of a heart of cheerfulness, a heart of gratitude, a heart of abundance, where we are trying to become more like Jesus Christ. Now today, to close out this series, I want to close out with a very personal message to me. But before I get into that, let me ask you maybe a strange question. Have you ever heard somebody give a testimony or share their story and been a little frustrated after it? I'll give you an example. I've heard this so often. Somebody gets up there and they're like, oh, I was struggling and I really wanted a job promotion. Or I was really trying to get pregnant. Or I was trying to get this business started up. Or I'm trying to find the right spouse. And so I was struggling, but I prayed to God, turned it over to him, and he answered my prayers. Now, don't misunderstand me. Those stories are incredible and they're inspirational, and I feel like some of us need to hear them. But I also feel like sometimes the conclusions can be a little bit misguided. Meaning, okay, if you're struggling, you pray to God, God will help answer your prayers and get you through that situation. But what happens when you're struggling, you pray to God, and the answers don't come in the way that you want them? The reality is we all face times in our life where we go through struggles and trials, and even if we're turning it over to God, we realize that the end of that trial just leads to the beginning of a new trial, a beginning of a new challenge. And the old thing didn't get answered how we wanted, but then we have this new struggle that's stacked upon it, and we ask ourselves in those moments, where is our faith? I mentioned this a little bit, but after we lost Chloe, I spent a lot of time in Philippians chapter 4. And I go back to Philippians 4, chapter 4, verses 11 through 13, which says, "Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and needs. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." And so often as Christians, we like to take Philippians 4:13 out of context and say, you know what, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And we start using it like, you know, if I want to be an athlete, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. If I want to get this job, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But we disconnect it from verses 11 through 12, which is being content in all circumstances. The reason why Paul was able to accomplish what he accomplished for Christ's mission is because he realized that his circumstances don't dictate his faithfulness. His attitude and actions are not dictated on his circumstances. Likewise, our pains, our sufferings, our challenges that we go through should not dictate whether or not we are faithful to God. I can't say, you know what, I'll be a wise steward of God's resources if God makes sure everything works out for me, in my favor. That's not how it happens. Now, to help illustrate this point, turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 39. And I love looking at the story of Joseph's life for a variety of reasons. He's one of my favorite characters. In fact, there's been times where Jonathan will accuse me of just, if I get a chance to preach, it's either on Stewardship, Joseph, or Samuel. And he took Samuel earlier in the series, so I'm going to preach on Joseph. But I love Joseph's life because he teaches us a variety of lessons that we need to follow as wise stewards of the resources God has given us. Now, Joseph's life didn't start off too bad. Now, he was one of 12 siblings, and he was the son of Jacob. Jacob being very important in the nation of Israel's history. Jacob is the one that God renamed to Israel. The problem with Jacob, though, I won't give him credit for being a great dad, because clearly he had his favorite, and that was Joseph. Now, can you imagine you have if you're a father, you have a bunch of siblings. In one sibling, you're like, okay, I'm going to give you all the special treatment. Like, you get the nice clothes, you get the special rewards, you get this pretty thing, you get spoiled. And you expect your other kids not to be a little upset about that? I mean, Jacob wasn't too bright, but he's giving Joseph the coats of many colors and doting on him and all this stuff. Surprisingly, Joseph's siblings didn't like it. They had a problem with it. So we actually see that when Daddy was away and they had a chance, they grabbed Joseph and then threw him in a pit. And if that weren't enough, they thought about it for a hot second. Hey, should we kill this dude? Let's just get Joseph out of the picture. Thankfully, they did not do that, but they decided they were going to sell him into slavery. And I always joke, every time I talk about Joseph, I feel like I have a special connection with him. I've shared this before, but growing up, I had older brothers, and like Joseph, they wanted to kill me. Like literally, they tried to kill me. But thankfully, they're only 3 years older, so their capabilities were slightly diminished when I was a baby. But one year, they dug a pit. And they found some broken glass, and they threw it at the bottom of the pit, and then they tried to cover it up with some grass and stuff. I think I was like maybe 4 or 5 at the time. And so I come up there. I was young, but I wasn't dumb. And so I see this. I'm like, I'm not accidentally walking into this. But then, being good brothers, they just come up behind me and then shove me in anyway. So, but thankfully, they did not sell me into slavery. So that's where our stories do kind of diverge a little bit. But anyway, back to the story. If you were Joseph, seriously, your brothers have turned their backs on you, sold you into slavery, what would be your mindset? Because I could be, obviously we see that he gets sold into slavery and then gets sent off to a foreign land. And if I were in Joseph's situation, it would be real easy for me to be bitter and angry, not only at my brothers and my family, but also God for letting me in this situation. But we're going to pick up the story in Genesis chapter 39, starting in verse 2. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And he was in the house of the Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. And he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. And when I read this, I really have 2 lessons that I want to take away from this. And the first one is this: God never abandoned Joseph. Even away from his family in a foreign land as a slave, who do we see with Joseph? God. And it's so often when something bad happens to us and we're not living up to that picture that we want, that we feel like, all right, God's not with me. He's left me. But unfortunately for us, the picture that we see is often blurred and vague compared to the clear picture of our lives that Jesus sees. And the second thing that sticks out to me is the fact that in all of this, I can't imagine Joseph, if he was a lazy, bitter, angry servant, would have been successful in Potiphar's house. But obviously we see that he thrives there because God blesses him. But part of the reason God blesses him is even in his bondage, he serves faithfully. He works hard. He does what he needs to do. He is trustworthy to not only God, but also Potiphar. And so often when I think about that, can we always say the same thing? Like if we don't get a job promotion or a raise that we want, or we don't get the job that we're looking for, we sometimes feel like that gives us a right to complain and not bring the effort that we need to. I mean, we have a current TikTok generation that talks about quiet quitting. This whole idea that we somehow have the right to go to work, but yet still not put in the effort that we're supposed to. But here we see Joseph, even as a slave, working hard, and God blessing him for it. But unfortunately, we see his story goes from bad to worse. In verses 6 through 7, it says, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, 'Lie with me.'" See, at this point is when we truly see the character of Joseph. It is easy, if your life is one series of struggle after struggle, for you to start rationalizing what your moral code is. But that's not Joseph's response. In verse 8, "But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in his house. And he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you. Because you are his wife, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?'" Now, obviously, it's good that we see Joseph. He has this loyalty towards Potiphar. He says, "Your husband has entrusted me with everything in his household. I have all of this control." But Joseph never forgot who he truly was accountable. It wasn't Potiphar that he was mainly concerned about. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? See, unfortunately, Christians too often allow their circumstances to dictate their faithfulness, but not Joseph. The story picks up in verse 10. And as they spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that she had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until the master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as the master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is the way your servant treated me. His anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. So once again, we see that Joseph, through no fault of his own, not a sin that he committed, not an error in judgment that he made, he finds himself in a much worse situation, accused of a crime that he didn't try to commit. At this point, you might be able to say, if you were in Joseph's situation, would this be the point that you turn your back on God? Okay, I still was faithful even when my brothers threw me in a pit and sold me into slavery. I'll get over that one. Okay, now God, how could you let this happen to me? But is that Joseph's attitude? The answer is no. In verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of prison. And the keeper of prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were there in prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. In whatever he did, the Lord made him succeed. So we see the same pattern. Joseph's put in a new situation, but does God ever abandon him? The answer is absolutely not. And we also see not only does God not abandon him, that work ethic, that faithfulness, that trust, Joseph just pours it into his new opportunity. You know what? If God puts me in prison, I'm going to be one of the best prisoners here. And I'm going to start being faithful and proving myself trustworthy. That's exactly what happens. Now, I won't read the chapter, but in chapter 40, we see an interesting encounter in jail. There's this cupbearer that was thrown in prison. I guess Pharaoh got mad at him, stuck him in prison. And so they're in prison, and God starts giving this cupbearer a dream. This cupbearer, being next to Joseph, realizes that Joseph can interpret dreams. So Joseph helps the cupbearer out and says, I'll interpret your dream. And the dream was, in 3 days, this cupbearer would be restored to working with Pharaoh. But Joseph says, when you get your job back, remember me. Don't forget about me. Get me out of this situation. I helped you out. But what we see is when the cupbearer gets his job back, he forgets about Joseph. And for 2 more years, Joseph sits in a prison. I'd be like, at some point, I just want to give up. Every time I'm faithful to you, God, I look for opportunities to serve you. When are you going to get me out of this mess? But then it goes back to this picture. What God was doing was setting something up that Joseph couldn't see, but he was faithful. And after 2 years, God starts giving Pharaoh dreams. And the cupbearer's like, oh, wait, Pharaoh, by the way, I forgot about this, but there was a guy 2 years ago that helped me with this very same problem. Pull him out of prison and let him interpret your dreams. So Pharaoh gets Joseph out, and cleans them up and tells them the dream. And in the dreams, after hearing them, Joseph says, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have 7 great years. Like all your crops, everything's going to be great. This wonderful time of harvest, but be prepared. After these 7 years, you're going to have 7 famine years, and it's going to be so bad. And not only does Joseph interpret the dream, he gives them a solution. He says, now prepare in the 7 years and create a plan so that when the 7 years of famine come, you can take care of the Egyptians. And so Pharaoh hears this, and we see his response in Genesis 41, verse 37. And this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all of this, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up a hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And so often we read the story and we're like, okay, this is one of those success stories that I'm talking about. If I just follow God, guess what? I'm going to be successful like Joseph. But that's not the reason why I looked at this story and get so convicted by it. Because I feel like so many times we would never end up where Joseph ends up because we never had the same level of faithfulness that Joseph had. When we talk about, I want to be like Joseph, I want to be like Joseph when my family betrays me and sells me into slavery. I want to be like Joseph when even in slavery, I'm working hard and I'm serving Potiphar faithfully. I want to be like Joseph that even though I'm falsely accused of a crime that I didn't commit, I'm still faithfully serving God in prison. I want to be like Joseph that even when the guy that was supposed to help me get out of here, and I'm sitting in a prison for 2 years, I am still faithfully serving God. And then after all of that, Joseph is now in a position that he can serve God. It goes back to our circumstances do not dictate our faithfulness. And Paul understood this. He says in Philippians chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Because stewardship means faithfully serving God no matter our circumstances. So if God gives you a lot to manage and he gives you a lot of responsibility and things seem to be going well, it's your job to be faithful in those moments. But if life is beating you down and you're facing storm after storm after storm, it is still your job and my job to remain faithful. He is Lord. No matter where you're at, he is Lord. And the reason I said at the very beginning, like, this is a very personal message for me. In October of 2019, and I've already talked about how excited it was for us, my family, to be able to move to Huntsville, and we were building in a house, and we weren't yet moved into it. But in October of 2019, we found out that Hannah's mom had terminal cancer. And I remember in that moment we thought everything was going right, and then we just get hit with this. Well, a few months later, we get a surprise, and we find out that we're having a baby girl. And I remember in that moment thinking, okay, we're going through this devastating storm. But God is giving us this gift on the other side of it. Later that year, in August 2020, we find out that we lost our baby girl. And I remember being so devastated, having to hold my baby girl and not getting to bring her home. But what was worse is we leave the hospital, and my mother-in-law is in the final stages of her life. And to go home and mourn your daughter, but then somehow spend the remaining weeks you had with your mother-in-law, somebody so close, so dear to us, and then a month later she passes. And then a month after that, we find out that Hannah's aunt, somebody we were also close to, she has cancer, and then she passes in less than a year's time. And then we had a cancer scare with my dad and some other health complications. And then if that weren't bad enough, we found out that a close friend of ours, Kenny Matthews, he has an aggressive form of cancer. And in less than 3-year span, it ends with him passing away and leaving a young family, a couple of kids, and his wife, somebody close to us. And it feels like there is no end to the storms. There's no end to the pain. There's no end to the struggling. Life is brutal. Things aren't always, you have a struggle, you pray to God, God answers your prayer, and everything works out. Sometimes the struggle is pain after pain after pain, but will you remain faithful to who Jesus is? And during that struggle and during that battle and during that pain, I kept going back to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Because Paul's even writing about that. He's going to God and he says, I have this struggle. Lord, take it from me. And God's response in verse 9, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, that being Paul, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And it is so easy for us to let bitterness and anger and frustration consume us. And sometimes it's small things. We're going through these struggles and we say, you know what, forget God. I'm going to handle my finances however I want. Or we say, you know what, I'm not going to be faithful to church right now, or I'm going to neglect my walk with God. But in extreme circumstances, and I've seen this in several friends of mine who have turned their hearts away from the faith and have abandoned their families because they've been so consumed with their own struggles and with their own pain that they abandon everything. But I want our response to be more like Paul's. And I promise this is the last reference in Philippians, but I love the book. But Paul says in Philippians chapter 1, verse 12, he says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. And I always get amazed by that and okay, what is happening to Paul? Why is he saying this? And in verse 13, we see the answer. So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. There's two types of response to trials. There's where we can turn away from it and we can give up and we remain unfaithful, or we realize that what God is doing in our pain, in our trials, serves a much bigger purpose. See, Paul got excited. They threw him into prison, and he starts praising God. He's like, these fools, they're letting me preach to all their guards. The gospel's proclaimed. Likewise, Joseph, he saw these pains and these trials, and he realized, you know what? God had a bigger picture. Because of Joseph's faithfulness, multiple nations were saved. So at the end of his life in Genesis chapter 50, we see this interesting encounter because Jacob passes away, and I'm just going to say it, rightfully so. Joseph's brothers are scared. They're like, okay, Dad's gone. He's about to kill us in revenge. But this is how it's set up. In verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers in their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. I will close this series with one last principle, and it is the principle of perseverance. A steward is faithful even in the middle of life trials. We don't always get answers. Joseph, fortunately, he finally saw what God was working out in the big picture, in the big plan, but we don't always get those answers. I don't know why I lost my daughter. I'll never know why my mother-in-law was taken too soon. And I for sure can't comprehend why Kenny, somebody that I watched grow up from being very spiritually immature and a young baby Christian to somebody that was a spiritual giant and was leading at Village Park and left behind a couple of kids and an amazing wife. I can't see the picture. I don't know why that I had the 3 worst years of my life going through that. But I am confident that one day I'll see them in heaven. And that God rewards the faithful. And that sometimes the picture that he has for my life includes all that pain and struggle for a bigger purpose than what I see. In the middle of that struggle and that walk, I should not pull away from God because God never abandons us. He never turns your back. Just because you are struggling, just because you're going through something, does not mean that God has left you. But it could mean that God is working out something in your life that is for a much bigger picture and purpose. Just like God said to Paul, and what God would have said to Joseph, I feel like God is also whispering to us. My grace is sufficient. And it is our job to follow him faithfully. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we come before you and we thank you so much that you're a God that will never abandon us, never leave us, never forsake us, and that you're a God that's done everything and given up everything to have a relationship with us. And my prayer is, as we walk through this life, as we steward the resources that you have given us, that we remain faithful no matter the challenge, no matter the pain, no matter the heartache, and that ultimately the rewards that we lay are not for this life, but for the kingdom of heaven. And that one day when we have a full picture and we see the full beauty of your plan, that we can celebrate together. It's in your holy and precious name we pray. Amen.